Good evening, everyone. Hi, this is Nikita, and welcome you all for the Space Talk at SSERD. We're so sorry for being late. We had technical glitches in starting off. We were trying something new, but yes, we were eagerly waiting to come to you and share. Or start off our today's program. So first of all, thank you so much for everyone who are still waiting to listen to today's Space Talk. So let's welcome Deepika. Hi, Deepika. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Nikita. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, a lot of your fans are really waiting. So let's quickly start off. But let me introduce Deepika a little bit, okay? So Deepika Jeyakodi is a commercial contract officer at an aerospace and defense company in the Netherlands. She holds an advanced LLM in air and space law from the Leiden University and LLM in international law and Indian constitutional law from the Madras University, a diploma in IP laws and a BABL honors from TNDALU in Chennai, India. So many universities, please bear with me. But it's really nice to call out all the universities. And I'm pretty sure they're so proud of Deepika. And Deepika attended the ISU's SSP in 2018. She's the co-founder of a Human Rights India and practiced law at the Madras High Court prior to moving to the Netherlands. She recently co-authored a book on innovation strategy. Amazing to have. I mean, we are so happy and excited at SSCRD because this is the first time we are in fact talking about something called as space law. And believe me, I got at least 10 to 20 messages telling, is there something called a space law? Do we have a profession called as space lawyer? And I have to say, yes, we do have. And here you go. We also have our guest today, Deepika, who is also a space lawyer. So, Deepika, thank you so much again for accepting our request. And please take us through, we're all people, as I said, we don't know what is space law. So tell us what is space law, how did it start, and what does it say? Consider space law for dummies. We're all dummies, okay? So just take us through every bit of space law in the way that we all can understand. Yeah, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nikita. I hope everyone can see my screen now.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so right to this. Well, I think a lot of the people who are watching this session now are people, I wouldn't call them dummies. They are people who are super interested in space. So I'm glad that you're all here. Today, my main goal is that at the end of the session that you leave with 3 key takeaways. One is that you know what we mean when we say space law. It's not that hard. It's simple to understand, and I hope at the end of the session you'll be able to tell other people what you know about space law. We'll go over some of the key principles that space activities, human activities in space. Let's call it that. Of setting the legal challenges that we face as the scenery of, let's say, space activities change. And if by the end of this, you're curious enough to go out and learn more, then I would have achieved more. Lawyers and space law, it seems like it's a completely new thing and it's super fancy and all that. It's actually quite old. The first writing on space law can be traced back to 1910. And I imagine when people were writing about space law then that it was probably a bit like fiction, but still here we are. So it's been as old as that. And the actual space law, as we know it today, started around the time of, let's say, World War II. So we saw significant progress in space technologies already in countries like Germany, then USSR and USA, even before the World War II. But just after the World War, these activities got an even bigger boost. And leading up to the International Geophysical Year, there was this sort of competition between the rival countries, USSR and US, on who was the first to get to space and who would do different things, because that signified some sort of power. So when this was happening, you can imagine that the international community was very concerned that the rivalries on Earth will extend to space, that space will just become another field where there will be conflicts and so on. And in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, the fears were amplified. So there was a need to create specific rules. There was a need to extend international cooperation so that we can avoid conflicts in space, that we can ensure that any activities in space are peaceful, and that any activities in space are for the benefit of mankind or humankind in general. So you need to think about the timing of this as well. So the late 50s, early 60s, that was also the time when several countries were freeing themselves from colonial powers. So there was this, all the things that happened then you see reflected in international space law. So when we go through the different principles, you'll notice that this was the mindset under which the law was created. So in 57, the Sputnik is launched. 58, the United Nations General Assembly makes a resolution. So a resolution is a sort of formal statement they make about countries' opinions or willingness on addressing a certain issue. So the issue that they wanted to address was that space activities are done in a peaceful manner and in the interest of all humankind. So this resolution was passed in 1958. And to make this more actionable, they set up an ad hoc body. And this body was called the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space. So there were initially 18 members who started with this, and they had the responsibility to deal with making sure that space was a peaceful arena. And in 1959, this body becomes a permanent one with 24 members. What's interesting is that India was a party to this committee from the beginning, right? And today there are 95 members and several international institutions and organizations that participate as observers. So what exactly does this committee do? This committee was instituted so that they can review the scope of international cooperation in the field of outer space and its activities. They conduct a lot of research on different issues. They use it as a platform to share different information from countries. And they also look into how they can address the different legal challenges that come up. So you see on the slide that this committee itself has two other subcommittees. One is the scientific and technical subcommittee. So if you talk about issues like debris and how we deal with it in terms of a technical perspective, you would see that addressed there. And then you have the legal subcommittee, which would look at, of course, the legal aspects of it. And this committee is the body that builds the different agreements that we will see later on that define how we conduct ourselves in doing space activities. So when we talk about space law, it's not a single document. It's not one document which has all the rules that say, okay, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do. Just as how we have a wide range of activities, you have laws that also deal with different things, or at least provide some sort of a guidance on how we deal with these different things. And the first thing that you start off with is general international law. So general international law, think about the United Nations Charter, the judgments from the International Court of Justice, the general principles that are in, let's say, that are followed by most nations, or sometimes what you call as a custom, which is a practice that people have that countries have built up over time, and which they now think, okay, everybody is doing it. We've been doing it for a long time, so this is now a standard. So this is general international law, and we considered space law to be a specific branch of general international law. And then we have international space law itself, which comprises of a few treaties, certain principles, and a lot of other documents that deal very specifically with subjects in this field. And then you have other fields of international law. So you have to go back to the time when they made the law itself in 1958. You can imagine that we couldn't have imagined how far we would go in terms of conducting space activities. So we couldn't put everything into the law, but then there are provisions which we can go back to. So for example, you could say that, okay, if there are environmental questions, we can go to see how international environmental law works, or how international human rights law work. So you can refer to other related subjects to also deal with things in space. And then, of course, you have regional and national space laws. These can be multilateral or bilateral agreements itself. For example, you have the European Space Agency, which can be considered, which is set up under a structure which is, let's say, which is built around regional laws. And then you have national space laws. As many of you know, India is developing its own national space legislation. So you can see that there are three, let's say, two levels. So you have general international law, under which you have space law treaties and principles and so on. And then from that, you can derive specific things for national laws as well. So that's how the structure works. And then apart from these four, which you can call as hard laws, you have something called a soft law. And soft laws are guidelines, standards, and codes of conduct. So basically, these are not things that are legally binding. So nobody can say you have to do this, but it's more something where you say it's good if you do this. So this can set up a standard way of working. This can make sure that we all speak the same language when we are addressing certain issues, or simply that if you do this, then it's in everybody's interest. So that's soft law. And then we go on to what treaties and laws deal with space specifically. The best, or the biggest creation out of all was the Outer Space Treaty, which we will go into detail in just a few minutes. This was created in 1967. There are about 110 countries that have adopted this treaty. This lays down the principles on how we conduct space activities. And then certain principles from the Outer Space Treaty, they were amplified and made into separate agreements. So first you have the Rescue Agreement that deals with the recovery and rescue of astronauts and space objects. And then you have the Liability Convention. This deals with what sort of damages can happen when you launch, or damages in space, who's responsible for it, how do you deal with things if there is a damage. So that's the Liability Convention. Then you have the Registration Convention, which is about identification of space objects. So let's say it's putting a mark on an object that you send to indicate that, okay, this goes from this particular country and so on. And then you have the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement is quite special. So it is a valid international agreement. But since the biggest space powers, so that's US, Russia, and China, since they are not parties to this agreement, it does not have the same operative value as the other agreements. And so it's basically just adopted by 18 countries. Even so, it has several valuable concepts that you can take into account when you think about the situations where we would be using it in the future, particularly with now when we talk about resource utilization in space, asteroid mining, and things like that. So if we dive into the Outer Space Treaty itself, Outer Space Treaty is, of course, the short name for it. The full name is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including Moon and other celestial bodies. So the key things that you need to pick out of this are this treaty is basically setting out key principles. It doesn't detail every single thing, it's just the principles. And it governs the relationship between different countries. It's not individuals and organizations. Of course, they say, okay, this is between the countries, and then they allow for countries to deal with the national activities and so on. But it's predominantly just between different countries. And it talks about the exploration and use of not just outer space, it's the moon, the celestial bodies, so it's the other planets, your asteroids, and name it. If somebody asks you what is the space law, what does it mean? You have different questions that pop up. What if a crime occurs in space? Who owns the moon and things like that? The Outer Space Treaty gives clear sets of principles that are still valid. So despite the immense technological advancement, they still cover all the activities. So what can you do under the Outer Space Treaty? Remember how the UN wanted to make sure that the activities in space are conducted peacefully. So for that, there were certain things that were put out. So one is that all countries are free to explore and use outer space. So it's not just countries with space power, but also developing countries who may not have the capabilities today, but will do so in the future. So it's free to explore and use by all countries. It should be explored and used for the benefit and interest of all countries, or humankind in general. So what does this mean? Do we all individually benefit from it? Of course, it's not easy to say it in black and white. The benefits come to us in different ways. So it may not be that, okay, because somebody is launching a satellite, I immediately get a benefit, but it does flow to us. So that's one of the things. And then, of course, that you use the moon and celestial bodies for peaceful purposes. And the underlying thing of all these things, when you do them, is that you promote international cooperation and understanding. And what can you not do? The first key principle is that there is no appropriation. It means that nobody can say this part of space or or part of the moon or a celestial body belongs to me. So nobody can raise a claim to it. There are some people who ask, okay, what about planting a flag on a celestial body, for example? That's just an indication to say, okay, we got here, or writing on a wall. Think about this. If you scribble on a wall, I was here, it doesn't mean that the monument belongs to you. So it's just something like that. And then the second absolute don't do is the placing of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in space or the celestial bodies. These are the key principles that you need to keep in mind when somebody asks you, what does Outer Space Treaty do? And then it lays down certain principles which are obligations. So the first one is that the astronauts must be given every possible assistance in case of let's say a challenging situation, and this is of course amplified in the rescue agreement that we saw earlier. And then in furtherance of let's say international cooperation and building trust and so on, if you conduct a dangerous activity in space, you must carry on consultations with the international community. You must inform the UN Secretary General about it. Of course, how far this is followed is a bit debatable, because we see countries doing ASATs and so on, which is a bit questionable. Do they actually follow this? Well, it's not as easy to say. And then they say that, okay, if you have a station or an installation in a celestial body, let's say India has a facility on the moon, and there's another country's facility close by. You can, on the basis of reciprocity, say that, oh, we will visit your station and you can visit ours. So these are obligations. And then you also have actions for countries itself. So remember how the Outer Space Treaty or international law in general deals with the relationships between countries. So what sort of role do countries have under the Outer Space Treaty? Countries are responsible for their national activities in space. So whether it's an activity that's conducted by the government, by private actors who are nationals of the country, or let's say a private entity that's registered in the country is responsible for all those activities. So following this, you can make national space legislation. So if India's space bill comes out, it's in furtherance of this let's say this action that the state can do under the Outer Space Treaty. And then you have an interesting concept of the launching state. A launching state can be a country who's doing the launch, a country who is buying a launch from another country, or a place from where a launch takes place, either a territory or a facility and so on. And the country that's responsible for the launch this way is liable for any damage that is caused by their space object. So let's say a launch takes place and it explodes and it creates some sort of a damage for human beings or parties, then it is the responsibility of that country to deal with it or to compensate and so on. And it's the same when, let's say, two satellites collide in space. You have a way to determine, okay, whose fault was it? And then say, okay, it was this country's object that created the damage, and it is this country's responsibility then to be liable for these damages to the other country. Of course, it's in space, as many of you know, the physics of it. It's hard to determine how the fault was caused. So it's quite interesting to see how this will evolve in the future. And the last role that states have is that once objects are registered under their name, they have the jurisdiction and control over the object. So again, it attaches a sort of responsibility on that country to deal with how activities are conducted with that space object or around the space object. So that's in general about the Outer Space Treaty. Just to give you a short recap, there are do's, there are don'ts, there are certain obligations under the treaty, things which the states have to take control over. Right? And if we go in, hey, now we are doing great things in space, but there is no law to deal with it, or the law is just not enough, we need to create a new thing. In my opinion, if somebody says there is no law to deal with it, that is wrong. Of course, there are quite a lot of gaps in the Outer Space Treaty or in international space law in general. But you should always remember that the key principles are defined. And these principles can always guide us in how we conduct the activities. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't create any new laws. Of course, we are adaptive beings. So we tend to go with the flow. We tend to catch up with technology in a way. We did that when the space race happened. Of course, we went out, we created a law, and it's worked well so far. But of course, there are things that we have to adapt ourselves to, and that's where soft law is stepping in now, because now we look into how we can work with different things, even though they are not legally binding documents. For example, with debris. You would have heard a lot about it from Dr. Moriba in the last weeks. An example of this, as you can see in this slide, is that although you don't have specific, let's say, a treaty that deals with debris, there have been several steps that we've taken over the years. So NASA, as a space agency, came up with rules on how they can remedy space debris, and this was later adopted internationally by the Committee on by the UN Corpus and the General Assembly. And also from an industry perspective, you see that several organizations or several companies and different institutions, they come together to say, okay, let's set a standard for ourselves. Let's say this is how we will build satellites. This is how we will dispose them. So it's not that, although there is a lack of fixed laws, there are things that are happening that help us deal with the situation. Is this for the best? Are they effectively dealing with the situation? Is of course a different question, but then it is happening. And then if we go back to some of the other challenges, there are things to do with keeping space activities peaceful still. 2019 was quite an interesting year where we saw a lot of announcements from different countries where they said, okay, we are going to build these forces within our military to deal with space. We have to protect and defend them just in case somebody else does something. And you soon saw that space was evolving into a war-fighting domain. And it's still the case, but it's important to see how we can maintain the peaceful use in a way. So you have projects like Milamos, where they are trying to create a manual to see what international law will apply to military activities in space. So you can't just apply all the military rules and regulations that we use on Earth to space as well. It simply doesn't work. So then we have to think about how we adapt ourselves towards that. The same applies for how we deal with cybersecurity in space. What if adversaries are jamming each other's satellites? What if services to civilians are cut because of that? So these are issues that we deal with. And then you have, of course, science and environment, which is quite important. As much as we want to satisfy our curiosity in space, we must make sure that we preserve and protect, let's say, the way outer space is now. I cannot imagine what could happen, but in general, that we just preserve and protect the environment. So you have agencies like the COSPAR, which deal with environmental, what sort of environmental restrictions and procedures you need to take into account to minimize risks pertaining to environmental impact and so on. And recently, you would have also seen discussions about how the Starlink constellation is interfering with scientific observational data. So how do we balance these things? That's a challenge. And then the most interesting, or let's say the most talked about thing, is also the presence of or the rise of private actors in space. So it's not just governments, it's not just different countries, agencies doing activities in space. You also see a rise in private parties. How do we deal with the different ambitions that they have? Asteroid mining, for example, is a topic that we often talk about. And here you see the Hague International Working Group. They worked on the principle of adaptive governance, and they came up with a set of building blocks that different countries should take into account if they make their own national laws. For example, if the US says, okay, we are going to allow our citizens to mine a certain asteroid or the moon, then US as party to the Outer Space Treaty should also make sure that they comply with the regulations. They must make sure that the key principles are not disturbed. So in a way, the building blocks also serve as a reminder to say, okay, we see that you need to do this, but you should do this keeping in mind these considerations. Another interesting thing is also commercial remote sensing. Of course, this was one of the first capabilities we developed with space activities. And there are a few things that need to be addressed. For example, what are the intellectual property concerns when you use commercial remote sensing data? Who does it stay with? There's an essence of national security. Are you allowed to look into another country's, let's say, activities, and how is it? How is that taken into account? And of course, you also have discussions on privacy. So these are, let's say, a high level overview of the challenges, legal challenges that are posed to existing international space law. But these are being dealt with in different ways. And it's not easy to just say, okay, let's just come up with a new law. There are a lot of technological things you need to take into mind. You have to balance the interests of several different parties. There are countries with space capabilities, that are countries that don't. So how do you put this all together? This is something that space lawyers work with day in and out. So that's just an overview about international space law in general. And then we go on to India, which is, of course, India is not, a lot of people tend to think that India is a late starter when it comes to space. Actually, we've been involved in, let's say, space related, in the field of space since the late 50s and 60s already. And if you look into our cultural context, of course, there's a lot written about that as well. But in the field of modern space, let's say we have been involved since the beginning. And now you're seeing this transition where we are going from, okay, let this not just be a public government activity. Let's give room for private actors as well. And there's quite a lot, let's say there's quite a lot that's happening, but there's also quite a lot that needs to be done. So we do have space policies in the national, the satellite communication policies, the national remote sensing policy, and so on. And you have a draft bill as well, which is a great effort. But there are, you see that it's hard to give control away to private parties and to make it more participative. So it's we are in a position where we could do a lot, and it depends on how we are going to deal with this in the future. There are about, I think, around 500 suppliers or entities that work with ISRO. But for example, they cannot go to the international market with their products because they don't have the intellectual property on the things that they manufacture. It vests with ISRO. How are we going to deal with that? And let's say you're a space startup that is trying to figure out, okay, how do things work? You have to go scramble and look for information in multiple places. So there's also this demand for having a single window, let's say, clearance information system where you can just go to them and tell them, okay, I have this issue, I need to know about this, or I need to put this product on the market. How do we deal with this? And in the law itself, personally, I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of things we can learn from other countries who built national space laws, and we don't always have to follow as well. We could probably be one of the first countries that puts out clear rules on space debris management, or clear rules on what we do with what we do for the betterment of the space environment, and so on. And there are different reasons why you need to do this. You don't have to see it as, okay, the government giving away the control to the private parties. These two can coexist together. That would be the best way to make good use or optimal use of the resources that we have. And it provides a lot more clarity in how we engage in space activities. It gives support. It gives a lot of support to, let's say, smaller players when they want to start out on something. You have a brilliant idea. You think you have a great technology. You're out in the market, but because you have uncertain policies and laws, perhaps you don't get investors, or perhaps you're blocked from going to the market for that reason. So it's important that different stakeholders come into play to create a good ecosystem where both public and private entities can sustain themselves, so that we can get a stronger foothold as a space power. And with that, I'm going to complete my presentation. And I think as last remark, you should remember that space is not just geopolitical. It's not just it's not just technical. It's something, I think we as kids, we begin to know about space as something that creates curiosity in us. So it's cultural, it's social. And when we talk about commercial and geopolitics, we should keep that in the back of the mind as well. So that's what drives me as a space lawyer, and I hope you viewers also take that into account in whatever you do in relation to space. Thank you. Over to you, Nikita.
Wonderful, wonderful, Deepika. As I said, like it just took us, everyone who were very new, who actually question ourselves if there is something like this actually. So it was really, really, really nice to know everything that's happening with space law, like how is it formed, or what is that even we're facing now, or what could be done in your field. For example, when we say space technology, if we talk about rockets, we can say, we could do such kind of improvements in the rockets. It was so good to know that you said, we can, even we do work in these kind of areas. We have to work and we need to change few things. So those things were like really, really interesting for me personally to know, and I'm pretty sure all the audience would have loved. So, dear audience, I think you all would have loved her presentation and her own experience of being in this field and everything. But still, we still have some time. I request each one of you to put down your questions, and which we can ask to Deepika, and Deepika will answer us. So start putting your questions. Until then, I do have few questions. Deepika, you told us everything about space law. But
yes,
you didn't tell us about you. Like, how did you even start from here in India to where you are now? What is your work experience? Like, how did you even reach reach the place where you are now, or the conditions?
I think it's not a very special story. It's something that I think many of you can relate to. I studied for the most of my life in India, and it was not my intention to become a space lawyer. But when I was in my I think in my 7th grade, my dad brought home a book on it. It just said pocket law, and then it spoke about different elements of law and things. And one particular part really captured my attention. So that was on air and space law. And I thought, okay, this is super interesting. And it was just gone. And just like I think a lot of you, I was interested in science fiction. I watched a lot of let's say movies that had references to space and things. I was mostly a better science student than I was anything else. But at some point, I decided, okay, there are way too many engineers and doctors in my family, so I should do something else. And I thought, okay, why not law? Because this seems like a super interesting subject. And then that's how I chose law. And I remember my mother even crying when I told her, okay, I'm not going to do science. And then I ended up doing law. Again, space law was not something I was that drove me to do whatever I did. Since I was a first generation lawyer, it was quite challenging to understand how courts work, how in general the legal field works. But luckily for me, I had some very cool teachers who pushed me beyond what I thought I could do. Some amazing friends who first introduced me to court life, and very good mentors that I've worked with during my court break. And at some point, I met someone who said, maybe you should think about doing air and space law at Leiden. I didn't even know where this place existed then. I thought, okay, I'll just take a break for a year. I'll go learn something. I'll come back. And then I started working as an intern in the company that I work for now. And 6 months later, I got a job there. And in my daily life, I just deal with, let's say, different space projects, their contracts negotiation, making bids and proposal responses and things like that. So it's not a spectacular story, but that was the trajectory.
No, you can't say that it is for us, because as you just said, we are so much into the science related topics or career or education. I mean, we don't look into something when we say about space or something. So you actually took up a complete different path, and but still you are in the same field of space. So of course your story is something interesting, because you will not believe the number of questions that we got. A lot of them asked, how did she actually become a space lawyer, because we all know how to become a space scientist or space engineer, but we don't know how you become a space lawyer. So of course it is really, really interesting to know how you went through and what is your journey and things. Now let me kind of ask you one more question. When you said air and space, so if you could just explain us, what is the difference, what is the major difference between air law, space law?
Okay, I'll try my best. So air law, there are different parts to air law as well. Of course, it's a lot more specific. That also evolved through the years. It deals with public air law, which talks about, of course, the relationship between, again, how different countries deal with things. So there you talk about, say, for example, if you are, let's say, India, and then you say, okay, you're a neighboring country, you have a column of, let's say, a column of space within which you say, this is the territory within which aircraft can fly. So there are different elements that go with it. And then you have another part, which is private air law, which deals with, let's say, passenger protection, how you, all sorts of things. So think about this. If you are going from point A to point B, you just get on a plane, you land in another spot. But for that entire process to happen, there's a lot of things that goes on. So you must have countries that have bilateral agreements that allow for them to have flights land and take off from their territory. You need to have structures that manage airports. You need to have structures that look into operators that manage the airports. You need to think about, let's say, different sorts of criminal liability. What if you commit a crime inside an aircraft? How do you deal with that? How do you register different aircraft? And then there's this whole sector where you talk about financing different things. So just think about any business that you would do terrestrially, apply that to aviation, and that is aviation law. If that satisfies the question.
It does, Deepika. Thank you so much, because we heard about space law and we just wanted to know what is air law as well. But thank you so much. And so I just saw we have few people who are looking space law as career, and they are in the third year of their space. They're in the third year of law. I want you to kind of give her a few guidance on how could she work or follow what you did, like towards space law? How could anyone, in fact, develop a career in space law? And what are the opportunities? In fact, I want you to highlight another point. How about women being in this space law career? Uh, what do you talk? What do you tell about this particular point of women in the space law?
Yes. So let's start with how you can become a space lawyer. I think these are my recommendations, of course, and maybe what works for me doesn't work for you. But I truly believe that you need to have a sound basis in your bachelor's program. So try to pick a focus point, have a good basis in international law. That's very important, and try to have different focus points, because space law is one of those fields where you cannot just bury your heads in the books. You need to have an understanding of all the other fields as well. So you need to have an understanding you'll be working with. So you cannot make laws for asteroid mining if you don't understand how asteroid mining works and what sort of technical limitations you have as well. So have a sound basis in law, pick a focus area, but also be open to the, let's say, the technical aspects of it. And let's say, for me, what really helped was also having the court practice. I think for my own experience, I was still a beginner. It was still new for me, but there were just so many things that you learn from there. It could simply just be the virtue of being open to chaos, for example. So try to even pick out the smallest things in whatever you go through when you're studying law and whatever you do after that. And I don't know if a master is absolutely necessary, because there are some lawyers who don't have that. But I think it's very valuable if you spend some time focusing on the specifics of space law as well. So whether it's a master or if it's your own effort working in the space industry, or let's say an international organization and so on, it doesn't matter. But you need to have a certain number of let's say years or days, if you are super smart, just focusing on the space law aspects. And I think with that, you should be able to see what options open up for you. So a space lawyer is a broad term for me. That means a person who's studied space law. And of course, you can work as a space lawyer. You can work in different fields. So for me, I'm a contracts officer. You could work with pure legal parts. You could work with compliance. You can work with just export control in space. You could work with UN agencies, industries, startups. Your options are plenty. But make sure, but in order for these options to be open for you, you need to make sure that you have your basis quite solid and strong. And in terms of women in space law, I think I'm super fortunate that my first mentor in space law, Professor Tanya Mazon-Swan, I studied space law under her. So I think that, I mean, she already is a fantastic person who promotes, let's say, women as well in the field. And I recognized over the years that there are more and more women space lawyers, and they are not in the sidelines. That's what is important. They are out there. They are changing a lot of things. They are challenging a lot of things. So I would say the field is quite open to women. Of course, there are inherent things that we wish we could change, but it's there in every field. But I think women in space law in general, there are a lot of strong women. And if you would like to know who they are, what they do, and so on, get in touch with me or Nikita. And we'll try to see if we can put you in touch with them.
Super. Thank you so much, Deepika. Again, that should have helped all our audience who would like to take up space law as career? Because I still remember, Deepika, we had a program called as Girls in Space, and the girl students from all over India came with an idea of having different type of space career. And I was surprised to see that there was one girl to say that, okay, I want to become space lawyer. I mean, until then I didn't hear from anyone, and she was just in ninth grade. So I did realize, okay, she was just in ninth grade, and I was like, okay, this is amazing. We are actually seeing the difference. People are looking space as a broader thing and not just technical way. So it's really good, and it's really nice that you mentioned about Tanya. Yes, even I got to know about space law. Well, I was in ISU and she was the professor. So yeah, I share this similar experience as you from her, and it's really nice to just listen from her. It's really nice. And you have worked with her, you been her student, and that's amazing. Let's take a few more.
I'm just going to interrupt you 1 second. I think it's also important to know that it's not just people abroad who have our own bunch of space lawyers in India. I think that's also important. We have Ranjana ma'am, we have Rajeshwari ma'am, who are also engaged in supporting our space ecosystem. We have Ashok, and of course there are several others. So it's not that, again, it's not super new. It's not that there's nobody else in India. There are quite a lot of them. So feel free to reach out.
Superb. I really thank you for adding that point, because yes, we do have. I mean, in India, it's not something new. It's already been there, and people who have been working, these are like really the major people, and they have at least 2 decades of experience. I'm probably, I might be wrong, but minimum of 2 decades of experience they have, and they're really good, as Deepika said. And I had, I mean, I'm so lucky that I did interact with them, and they're so amazing and inspiring. So yeah, let's take a few technical questions which would be really challenging or interesting for you to answer. Uh, and fun also. Do we have illegal activities in space science career, and how does law act in that?
Illegal activities.
Yeah.
I'm very curious. I don't know if you're thinking about. I mean, the minute you say space science and illegal activities, I'm thinking about explosions in space. Perhaps not. Like we said, there are restrictions on how we deal with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in space. Of course, things may change if some country goes crazy and does something. So I guess we'd have to wait and see. But as far as law goes, I think there are enough restrictions that say, okay, space is for peaceful uses. Try not to do anything illegal. And it's the same if you're doing illegal stuff on Earth as well. I mean, just stay away from it.
True, true, very true. There was a very curious question which we got from one of the audience. So great. And I just want you to throw some light on the space policy that's getting drafted of India, and its impact on the private space startups, because a recent announcement of InSpace and a lot of announcement from India and ISRO. What would you say about that particular fact, considering space law and policy, Deepika?
Yeah, I think again, as I mentioned before, space law in India, it's still in its development process, and the Indian space community, for example, has given its feedback to the government as well. Things that they should take into consideration if private parties are supposed to thrive, and it's not that the private parties are asking for crazy things. It's just bringing more clarity. So I'll illustrate that with an example. Almost every country that has has a cap on liability. So if something goes wrong, like I said, if something goes wrong in space or during launch and so on, and the country becomes responsible, you may end up having to pay a lot of money to some other country or to some other organization and whatnot. So most countries have a cap on how much they can pay to another country under space law. And they have certain insurance requirements okay, so if something happens, how can we deal with insurance so that the victims can receive some sort of a relief, but you're also protected. Now imagine if you're a startup with a few million. Uh, your entire value is a few million. You do a launch, or something happens in space, and things go wrong. You have to pay a victim's compensation of several million. Your company can go completely bankrupt, right? So the space bill, as we saw it earlier, it just talks about having an open liability. There is no cap, which is a bit tricky if you want private parties to engage with you in space activities. And then there are a lot of rules about imprisonment and fines and things like that, which I understand where it comes from, that we need to protect the government, we need to protect the country, but it shouldn't be at the cost of putting the private parties to risk. This is just one example. So I think if the intention is really to enable the private sector, again for the common interest that we optimize our resources for, different stakeholders need to be engaged in a conversation. You can't slap a unidirectional law and say, this is it, deal with it. You need to hear the different voices to see, okay, what their concerns are. So we are hoping, fingers crossed, that this is done indeed, and that we reach an agreement on a law that creates a good environment for both public and private to exist together.
Got it, Deepika. Thank you so much for answering that question. Last but not the least, I wanted to know, how did your quarantine time go? What is that like? How did you spend time? What did you learn? Is there any message for all of us from your that part of life?
Again, my super personal opinion. I think for me the COVID situation was fortunately a bit interesting, because I never used to spend a lot of time at home. So this meant just staying at home, and it didn't mean that I went on a holiday. I was still working, so it was quite busy. But I enjoyed staying at home and working at my own pace. And I think personally for me, I took time to do a lot of things that I enjoy doing, which is just studying international law to brush up on it. For some people, that might be super boring, but I really enjoyed that. And the second one that I enjoy even more was just lazing around. So there were some people who said, okay, we need to be super productive. We need to learn everything possible during this COVID time. I didn't do that. So see what works for you. I think what is really important is that you check in with people around you. It's quite an isolating moment. And at the end, I mean, if we strip our degrees and designations and whatnot, we are all humans with the same emotions and things. So just make sure you check on your friends, your family, people that you haven't spoken to, see what they are up to, catch up on things. And maybe that's also something that you can learn from. So it doesn't have to be books and webinars and things. Try to reach out and do the things that you don't usually do.
Superb, Deepika. Thank you so much for your message. And yeah, it's really nice to know how you learned and how you kind of used your time just for yourself, and good to know. Superb. Thank you, Deepika, and I really want to thank you on behalf of the whole SSERD team, the audience over there on Facebook and YouTube, and everyone who's going to watch this video in the future. So thank you, a huge, big thanks to you, Deepika, and this for sure will help many to understand what law is, what space law is, and if there's someone who wants to get into this career, I think this should help them. Thank you so much for joining again.
Thanks to SSERD for showcasing space law on the Space Talk session. Before I go to my second thank you, it's important for the audience to know that Nikita and Sujay are doing amazing work with their team. So follow them, share news about them. I think do as much as you can to boost the great work that they're doing. And my last thanks is for the audience, of course, who've taken their time on a Saturday to listen to this talk. I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Deepika, and dear audience, thank you so much. Keep waiting until we bring another amazing person with another amazing topic related to space. Until then, stay home, or even if you're going to go out, please take care of yourself. Cases are increasing, but yeah, please do take care. Thank you so much for joining. You can reach out to our website to watch our other Space Talk videos by really, really amazing people, and do comment questions. We shall get back to you with the answers. Thank you all for joining. Take care. Bye bye.